Hello! Welcome to the recorded lecture on Iris Marion Young's article, Political Responsibility and Structural Injustice, published in 2003. I am struck by the force of reading this article during our COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, I think it helps us connect certain parts of our experiences over the last year with our broader social political field. The pandemic has shown us both the structures that have a real impact on our lives, as well as the injustices that can occur at the structural level. Injustices for which we can often identify many key players as blameworthy, but also we can identify many more folks connected to these circumstances of these injustices who we would not say are blameworthy, or at least not solely blameworthy. We're in a position now to see who is essential in virtue of the activities and institutions that we have considered as essential throughout the stages of lockdown, as well as how we, each of us, are connected to those structures. A grocery store clerk or a delivery person has to and has had to keep coming to work because we need them. But they've had a greater risk for contracting the virus, a risk that simply wasn't present in the same way before the pandemic. And some companies offer paid sick leave or increased or improved health coverage, but many didn't and still don't. Take Amazon's current anti-union efforts against workers organizing in Alabama, or the company's denial that the delivery drivers have had to go to the bathroom in their vans because of the concurrence of both public restrooms being closed due to the pandemic, as well as Amazon's rigorous delivery requirements for their schedules not letting up despite the global pandemic. So Amazon's employees have suffered in ways that they should not have had to, and they have taken on this extra labor and toll and risk without being compensated respectively for that extra labor and risk. And so we see this structural condition that a grocery store clerk or a delivery person is essential to our functioning society, but they are significantly underpaid or undercompensated. So they're coming to work, and some of you might be these people, you're coming to work because we need you, but also because you need to make rent this month and next month and every month. Institutional and governmental decisions about minimum wage, working conditions, affordability of housing and healthcare, as well as the very real needs that their jobs meet, are all rising to the surface of our attention. Because we are not supposed to be leaving our homes all the time. They have to go out and touch everybody's door and credit card. And the COVID-19 pandemic and the US's response to it has pulled the curtain back on just how much the different aspects at the structural level work in tandem to affect our lived circumstances. Before we begin in earnest, a content warning for this recorded lecture. This video contains brief discussion of suicide and violence. There are interesting and relevant connections between Young's arguments and the effects of the pandemic and our government's response to it. I recommend keeping these connections in mind as we move through her arguments and reflecting on new connections as they occur to you. So let's now get into the article. Let's look at some brief biographical and research info on Young and then take a bird's eye view of her article. Iris Marion Young was a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, focusing on the nature of justice and of social difference. Her approach to ethics was consistently at the level of social, placing our interpersonal realities with both people and institutions at the center of understanding our individual possibilities. Her project in the article admits of two related goals: to elaborate on the claim that judgments of injustice often concern structure, and to argue for a concept of political responsibility that is meaningfully distinct from individual responsibility. What she means by political, she says, is, quote, something wider than what state institutions do. It refers to phenomena and movements of collective action, where people work together to form public works and institutions, end quote. She says that on page 11. Young's thesis, briefly stated in her own words, is that, quote, the grounds for claiming that Sandy and those in similar situations suffer injustice lie in the fact that her difficulties are socially caused, end quote. That's on page 2 to 3. So we call her circumstances unjust because of the structural forces at work in preventing Sandy from finding affordable housing, and thus significantly diminishing her ability to live well. The injustice is socially caused because there is not one individual or entity responsible for her circumstances, but we all share the political responsibility of these circumstances. When we get to the 5 features of political responsibility, we'll tease apart this claim that we share responsibility for these circumstances. But for now, remember that Jung's responsibility is distinct from blame and is forward-looking. So we aren't all to blame, but rather our responsibility is a responsibility to work to change circumstances like the ones Sandy experiences. So let's consider directly the story of Sandy, a woman seeking housing for her and her kids that works with her budget, her job, and her kids' school. She goes through the normal operations of trying to make it work. She diligently apartment hunts, is willing to live somewhere that is not great for her nor her kids, but will suffice. She finances a car when public transport isn't an option. But ultimately, because of housing prices and policies applying to both her initial apartment and to the area she's trying to move to, she still faces the possibility of homelessness. Now note that even Sandy is not responsible for her housing issue. She does not exhibit any personal or moral failing here. Rather, she plays by socially accepted rules. She has a steady job and is a dutiful employee. She is a dedicated parent. As I see it, there are 3 points to Jung's including Sandy's story at the start of the article. First, it is a very common occurrence in the US. There are a lot of statistics available and they cut the categories differently, but basically, no matter how you cut it, about 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck with little to no savings. And second, to point out that when we look at examples like finding housing within one's budget and reasonable proximity to one's work, we see many ways that their efforts are interrupted by multiple unfair barriers, such that we do, or need to, recognize this as unjust. Which brings us to 3. Part of why we should see it as unjust is that this situation is not random bad luck, but rather it is predictable. As Jung puts it, quote, major causes of Sandy's misfortune lie in the normal operations of markets and institutions of planning, building, land use regulation, investment, finance, and exchange in American cities. And she says that on page 2. Jung's overall argument can be summarized as an issue of the incompatibility of concepts. On the one hand, we have an understanding of responsibility as individual, that there is an agent or entity culpable for some harm, and they are held accountable by us, assigning blame and demanding compensation. On the other hand, we recognize situations like Sandy's as unjust because she has been negatively impacted. Specifically, her circumstances have restricted her ability to live well, and she is not the cause of these circumstances. The problem is that responsibility as individual is not compatible with Sandy's circumstances, in that there is no one person or institution to blame or hold accountable to correct the wrong. This is a logical impasse. These concepts conflict. We either have to accept that Sandy's circumstances can't be solved, or we have to adopt a different understanding of responsibility. Structural injustice is descriptive, in that it is an analysis of how things are. Our structural components, our structural social societies, our structural states are unjust as they are, and it is descriptive in this way, while political responsibility is prescriptive, because as a concept, it captures Jung's argument for how things should be, given how they are. It is a sort of prescription of what is required to solve the issues of structural injustice. When it comes to social structure, the architectural illusion is helpful, but let's not take this spatial metaphor too far. As Jung states, quote, social structures exist only in the action and interaction of persons. They exist not as states, but as processes. The concept of social structure must also include conditions under which actors act, which are often a collective outcome of action impressed onto the physical environment, end quote. That's on page 5. On the next page of the article, Jung goes on to say that, quote, structures refer to the relation of social positions that condition the opportunities and life prospects of the persons located in those positions. This positioning occurs because of the way that actions and interactions involve people in other structural positions. The unintended consequences of the confluence of many actions often reinforce opportunities and constraints, and these often make their mark on the physical conditions of future actions, as well as on the habits and expectations of actors. This mutually reinforcing process means that the positional relations and the way they condition individual lives are difficult to change. End quote. That's on page 6. So in other words, the relationships and actions occurring at the level of institutions affects how we live our lives. They affect sometimes through explicit rules, like not qualifying or qualifying for subsidized housing, but also through less explicit norms, like a building owner converting apartments to condos, as well as through material means, such as not having enough money to pay rent somewhere due to the housing market driving up property taxes. So notice that these are 3 distinct institutional factors that happen to work together to affect one's actions and possibilities. We are then in a position where our actions then reinforce these factors. We move to places we can afford, and if you're high income or wealthy, this likely perpetuates the institutional forces affecting that physical space. And if you're low income or poor, this is also likely perpetuating the institutional forces affecting that physical space. From taxes to available schools and school funding to businesses deciding to open or being able to stay open. And so people, because of many institutional factors, make decisions about where to live. And then their decisions have a reinforcing effect on those institutional factors that were present in their conditions, in their considerations of where to live. So structure in the architectural sense gets at the fact that we are all operating and living in this structure, running into certain pillars, having to walk down certain hallways or wait in certain gathering spaces, etc. But the architectural metaphor doesn't capture that in a social structure. We are also always building, expanding, and renovating the structure because we are acting within it and according to it, and our actions reinforce or change its operational norms.